Hi, so I've been asked to do this short video about pilgrimage in the early Irish Church, or pilgrimage in Celtic Christian spirituality, because I'm involved in doing a course, and the person who's leading the course is a member of, as am I, the community of Brendan the Navigator. Come on, Brendan Nearfa. And in fact, I'm the vicar of Come on, Brendan Nearfa, or the community of Brendan the Navigator. And so I was asked to put this video together because our aim in the community of Brendan the Navigator is to promote the idea of pilgrimage and retreat and reflection. And we take as our inspiration St. Brendan the Navigator, who of course was famous for a particular pilgrimage that he undertook towards the end of his life, his sailing across the Atlantic. And that book, The Voyage of Brendan, was a bestseller in the Middle Ages and is a wonderful allegorical tale for the ups and downs of the Christian life, as well as a story about a great pilgrimage that gives great insight. Brendan himself also founded many religious communities, so that's why we took him as our patron. We are a community that's a dispersed religious community. We're based in the Church of Ireland, but we are open to all, and we organise walks and quiet days throughout the year, usually, although it's been a little quiet through the days of COVID. So because of that, and also because I used to be an archaeologist, and I've studied a little bit of the history and the monuments of the early Irish Christianity, that's why I'm being asked to give my thoughts on this subject. So, pilgrimage. Pilgrimage, first of all, is a nearly universal human activity. We like to go and to seek out. There are places that we go that speak to us, that speak to our hearts, places that we think of as being special, being blessed. So if we believe in a God, in a creator, there are places where we find it easier to link in that God or creator. The idea of the word holy is partially to be set apart. So there are certainly places that we set apart as being special. My personal understanding of the word holy is something that is holy is more in tune, more perfect. And certainly we can think of spaces or places where we can go that seem to be more perfect, that, as I said, speak to our hearts. In the early Irish Church, within that Celtic Christian ethos, there was a very strong sense of sacred space. There were lots of local shrines, holy wells, mountaintops, places that were thought to be sacred, as well as more famous places that were larger locations for pilgrimage. And the idea behind a lot of these can be summed up in the phrase made famous in Iona, the talk of a thin place. The idea behind this is that God is that which lies behind all of creation. But in some points of that creation, there is a thinner gap between what we perceive and what lies behind creation, i.e. God. And you can see that in the idea of the Celtic year as well. Part of the idea of Samhain is that the veil between worlds is thinner at Samhain. So this idea that there are places or there are times when things come together and where the distance between two worlds, be they physical or metaphorical, are not as much. So that idea of sacred space lends you to the idea that, well, if there is a thin place and I need to pray to God about any particular thing, I will go to that place. And quite often these are places which are kind of boundary places in and of themselves. So places where the brackish water stops, for example, coming up the Barrow. St Mullins, it's a place where the last tidal reach comes up the Barrow. And so that's a sort of a boundary place. Wells are also thought of as being a boundary place because it's where the bowels of the earth and the water comes up out of the bowels of the earth and comes out. Places close to the shoreline, quite often, there are sacred places on the shore. Mountaintops as well, sort of boundary places. So you have an idea of going to these boundary places, and some of them are places of particular association. So, for example, St Gobnat from Muskerry was very much associated with beekeeping. So maybe if you wanted to go and pray, if you were a beekeeper and wanted to pray about your bees, maybe you'd go to the Holy Well of St Gobnat, around the area where she had her monastic settlement, if you wanted to pray about bees. So the idea of getting closer to the ideal source lies there. There's another sense that is very strong within the early Irish Church, and that's of martyrdom. But in the early Irish Church, very few people were what they called red martyrs. Lots of people decided to become white martyrs. Now, this is something that's very much from the Irish Church, because people weren't being killed for their faith, so they didn't have to give up their lives physically dying for Christ. There was an idea that you could give up your life, as in give up the life that you had known, and go away from everything you had known to live for Christ. This was white martyrdom. So again, to mention Iona, St Columba, when he went away, that's why he chose Iona, because he landed at another island, but he could see his home from the top of the highest point on that island, so he had to go on further, which is why he chose Iona, because he couldn't see Ireland from there. And so he had become a white martyr, given up his old life. But there is a sense that sometimes for your faith, to closen your relationship with God, you could do that in a small way by giving up your life for a short time and going on pilgrimage. So, to give up your life for a week or a month to go to a holy site, go to a thin place, maybe go to one of the great monasteries where all these men and women of God were based, so you could get a closer relationship with God and then bring it back to your old life. There is also a sense within the idea of pilgrimage, particularly in the early Irish Church, that it is there not to get you something from somewhere else, but to help you discover something that should be inside of you. The constant presence of God in all things is very much woven into the fabric of the early Irish Church. The idea that there's a prayer for sweeping the floor, a prayer for doing the fire, a prayer for sowing grain, a prayer for reaping. And so, as well, there is a warning for people going on pilgrimage, which is very famous. My apologies if my pronunciation is very bad in this, but Cé leis an rov, Galer Sarah is beg barbuas a hias, Dodia down Cé gur foda log to a, Colfwig to Sorov, Mora hug to a. Who to Rome goes, much labour and little profit knows. For God on earth, though long you sought him, you'll miss in Rome unless you brought him. So the purpose of going on a pilgrimage is not to get something you lack, but it's to strip away all the dirt that's preventing you from making that connection with God within you. The connection that should always be there. There's one other sense that was particularly strong in the early Irish church. And whilst some people have described the early Irish church as being very Johannine in its theology and have argued for that, there is a sense that St. Luke was also very important in the theology of the early Irish church, and you can tell this if you look at the rule of Columbanus, who was very big on the Psalms and saying different numbers of Psalms whilst trudging either naked or fully clothed into cold streams. This is what he recommends if you fall into sin. But the reason he's recommending this is not because he wants to punish you for doing a wrong thing. So it's not that sort of crime and punishment view of theology, which you sometimes get maybe in the medieval sense of pilgrimage. The post-Norman Irish church may have had it, and very much in the mainland, this sort of going on pilgrimage, going and experiencing all this pain because of the brokenness and sin that you have caused in the world, and by inflicting the pain on yourself, you somehow become either earning the forgiveness of God or become a better person by feeling all this pain. No, in Columbanus's rule and in the early Irish church, the idea is of spiritual fitness, because sin is viewed far more in terms of disease than anything else. So, if you're diseased or if you're unfit, if you're unhealthy, you can go and do something to make you healthy. So, the religious are spiritual physicians. So, the reason why you go and stand in a lake reciting psalms is not so you feel miserable and feel the pain and decide not to do it again. It's to make you spiritually fitter, because saying the psalms is good for your spiritual fitness, and walking into freezing water is also going to be bracing and help you engage with this fitness program. So you trudge the pilgrim path in order to train your physical and spiritual self, to make yourself spiritually a fitter person. So it's not necessarily just about where you go, but about the journey of going there, making yourself more spiritually fit, so that when you arrive, you're more receptive and you can have that light and grace of God shine on you so strongly that you can take it back to your everyday life. So those are very much the ideas of pilgrimage that we can decipher from the records that we have. The other thing to remember to mention is that, as I said, there are small local sites as well as the more famous ones. So, yes, St. Bridget had her monastery and it was very famous, and so people flocked to it. It would have been a sight to see. There would have been many beautiful manuscripts and works of art, beautifully carved crosses in some of the big sites. But there are also small local sites, some of which wouldn't have been too much of a problem for you to take a day or two to go and visit. And that part of the religious round of early Irish society, because early Irish society was very much a dispersed society rather than an urbanised one, the early Irish church, therefore, took a similar model. Yes, we had our large monasteries, and it was very much a monastic-based religious system rather than a parochially and cathedral-based system. But you also had religious members going out to offer their services as chaplains, maybe to some of the more powerful families, but also being chaplains to small religious sites. And so there was a tradition that there would be a chaplain and maybe a caretaker in some of these smaller local sites. And around the country, there are lots of very small religious enclosures from the early Irish church, and these may have only had maybe the keeper of such a place would have been also the chaplain to such a place, somebody living on their own as a hermit, serving a small holy well. And sometimes maybe you have a priest and a local person or a local family, because sometimes this became a hereditary thing, looking after a small holy place. Sometimes maybe a small group. And so throughout the country, if you look, there are small local sites that might have pattern days or traditional days to visit them, as well as bigger places with more renown. So pilgrimage doesn't have to be I'll leave my life behind for a week or a month thing. Sometimes it can be just taking out a few hours to go to a special place, just to plug in and re-energize yourself. And all those different aspects would be part of what I would see as the tradition of pilgrimage in the early Irish church.